Welcome back to this week's Parent Parsha series, Parshat Tazria. It's also Parshat HaChodesh, and it's also the Yesh Tikva Infertility Awareness Shabbat. And so we have a lot of things that we can talk about. And I actually think that in some strange universe, it's possible for us to put all the different items together and continue on our theme of trying to think about ways to make the Parsha, the Pesach Seder a meaningful experience, an intentional experience, and a thoughtful experience. And I wanted to focus on an idea like we did last week that was shared with me both in Rabbi Rosner's Parsha share that he gave in person, I guess, in Israel, and also in his book. And he was commenting on the fact that we are introduced in this week's Parsha to the ideas of Tuma and Tahara, of purity and impurity, and thinking about ritual impurity, right? This idea that ritual impurity stems from the idea of where there is life and where there isn't life. And the first introduction we get in this week's Parsha to the idea of Tuma and Tahara, purity and impurity, has to do with Leda, has to do with giving birth. And it's an interesting place to think about, because in what moment more in time in somebody's life is a person so filled with life? When you are pregnant, you are filled with the essence of so much life that is inside of you. And he points out the fact that this is the most pinnacle, maybe prototype example of where there is a moment in time where you are filled with so much life, and then you bring that life, hopefully in a healthy way, forward into this world. And even though we're not celebrating, in other words, the act of being impure is not marking a moment of death, where oftentimes we do see that, right? We think of Tzara'at, which is almost like a death of the skin. We think about somebody who had a nida, who had a menstrual cycle, where that is a reflection of a life that had potential that no longer has that potential. We think about potentially the ultimate death is Tuma mate. So we're thinking about this idea of a reflection that something that is impure is an inability to be able to live, to have a certain amount of presence in this world. And therefore we're marking that it's not a real impurity, but it's a spiritual impurity, reflecting one of the most important aspects of Yahadut, which is this idea of being alive. We know that the most important thing that we have, Shabbat, that a person could violate Shabbat in order to save somebody's life, because we think about this idea that you violate one Shabbat in order to keep many more Shabbatot, that is the most holiness is our life and our ability to be active participants in mitzvot with our being and with our life, not by giving up our lives, but by being present and healthy to be able to be active participants in that life. And so thinking about this idea that Tumat Leda, which is what we start with, is the pinnacle example, because we actually, on the one hand, are bringing forth so much life in this world, but we're also experiencing, the person who gave birth is experiencing a loss of a second life that existed within them. And he also notes in his Sefer that the Tumat Leda is more for a girl, which is an interesting, I think, reflection of the fact that it's the potential of a potential. In other words, when you give birth to a girl, you're also mourning her own potential for life that will come to be. So it's almost like an extension of a loss that you're letting go of this ability, or that you had, which was hosting life in a very real and wonderful way. And it also got me thinking a little bit about the fact that when they talk about Leda, when they talk about what a person does after they've gone through this process of moving from their impure state to a pure state, women would bring a korban to the Beit HaMikdash. And that would be true if she brought a korban for whether or not she gave birth to a live child, or whether or not she gave birth to a stillborn child, or whether or not she had a miscarriage. And there are different discussions about, and I do not know the intricacies and details about what the cutoff would be in terms of bringing a korban or not bringing a korban, as it reflects the move and shift from Tumat Leda to a place of Tahora. But I think the piece that I always think about in such a powerful way is have this vision. There's this idea of keeping track of what korbanot I would be bringing when the Beit HaMikdash, not me per se, but one would be bringing when the Beit HaMikdash is rebuilt. You have to get past a lot of discussions in terms of would there be korbanot, would there not be korbanot, and if there were korbanot, what would that look like? Okay, so putting all of that aside, if we follow along with the line of thinking that yes, the third Beit HaMikdash will also have this idea of korbanot with them, what korbanot am I keeping track of, the korbanot that I should have been offering for this thing that I did wrong, or that thing that I did by accident, or this thing that I did intentionally? And so one of the images that when I first heard this idea, and especially like as it related to this idea, is how many korbanot would I be bringing forth for the children I have living in the world, for the miscarriages that somebody has? Like how many would you be bringing up? And it got me thinking about this idea, particularly as it relates to this Shabbat of the Infertility Awareness Shabbat, is we really have come so far in terms of really being thoughtful about our understanding of how much we don't understand, of how much we don't understand about somebody else's journey and what somebody else has gone through. We look at somebody's family, we make assumptions about their family. We might even ask questions about those assumptions. And we've come so far in terms of thinking about an increased amount of sensitivity about how we talk about children, how we talk about fertility, how we talk about pregnancy, how we don't talk about pregnancy, and really thinking about this idea and having this image of, for all the people that might have experienced a longing but never translated into a loss, for the person who tried to get pregnant over and over again and it never materialized into a pregnancy, for the people who it materialized into a pregnancy and evoked a loss, and for those that went on to Mirza Hashem to have live births, thinking about this idea of all of these women marching up towards the Beit HaMikdash and all carrying within themselves, or actually carrying korbanot that are a reflection of a life's worth of dreams, of yearnings, some of them fulfilled, some of them unfulfilled, and really pausing to, with that image in mind, the only way that I can think about it is a deep sense of humility and humbleness about the notion that we never know what's going on for somebody else. We can try, we can do the best that we can, but ultimately the humility and humbleness to know that I don't know what somebody else's dreams were. I don't know what other dreams somebody else had for their family, for their life, that they may have chosen to not actualize, or they didn't have a choice about not being able to actualize it. And so recognizing not just the people who are walking up to the Beit HaMikdash with their live reflection of their live births, and not just the people who are walking up to the Beit HaMikdash with their lives and their losses, or the person who's walking up with their losses, but also the person who's walking up maybe empty-handed with dreams that were never materialized for themselves. And so really trying to be thoughtful and reflective as we march into the Pesach Seder. We think about the Arba Banim, we think about the 4 boys, but really thinking about who is sitting around our table. Again, we come back to that. Before, we talked about last week in terms of setting ourselves up for success and asking ourselves who's sitting around our table in terms of, what do people need at that table? But also thinking about the idea of like, how can we be sensitive if we have so many people at our table? What is the content of the conversation? What is the energy? Are we really being thoughtful in a sensitive way to the best of our abilities? Because you're right, we live in a world, and the world can be a trigger for people. And so it has to also be that people can function, and people also have to figure out how they can take care of themselves when they find something that is upsetting to them or triggering to them. But I think that to the best of everyone's capability, if we enter into the Pesach Seder to some degree, really with a little bit of humility and humbleness, that maybe something that I find so enjoyable is actually quite hard for somebody else. Maybe even just talking about the idea that like the story of the Arba Banim could evoke in somebody this feeling that like, I don't belong. I'm one of those Banim who's asking really hard questions, or I'm one of those children who doesn't know how to ask, who doesn't know how to insert myself into this Pesach Seder in a way that I want to. And so really stopping no matter what the trigger is. It doesn't have to be something about fertility. It doesn't have to be something about children. It could be something about inserting themselves or feeling like they can talk or feeling like they've made choices that maybe they feel more marginalized over the last 1 or 2 years. And therefore they feel like they're not as connected to the family unit. How can we use the Pesach Seder as an opportunity to bring all members of the family back to the table in a way that allows them to feel alive? And now we return to this idea that we started with, which is the Pesach Seder, the Parsha of Tazria starts with this idea of noting the importance of life and the way it plays a role in our whole construct of Tuma and Tahara, and aiming for lives of Tahara. Not that Tuma is not bad, because the reality is it's actually, if we don't go through a time period of Tuma, then we haven't brought life into this world. So we want people to go through these ups and these downs, and we want people to feel connected and aspiring towards bringing life and recognizing the value and the importance of life, but also being mindful of the way in which we talk about it, the two ideas together. Rabbi Rosner shared another beautiful idea that in last week's Parsha, we talk about Shmini, which is all about, which, as we discussed last week, is about the things that we put into our mouth having to be kosher, the animals, which animals are kosher, which animals are not. And Tazria brings us to the idea that also the things that come out of our mouth have to be equally holy. We think about Tzara'at as being a very main focus of the discussion around Tuma and Tahara. And we know that Tzara'at is connected, leprosy, skin leprosy is connected to Lashon Hara. And so thinking that we really have to be equally as mindful about the things coming out of our mouths, and not just Lashon Hara, not just something that we know is so clearly the prototype example of what we shouldn't be talking about, but also thinking about being sensitive. Are we being sensitive people to the best of our abilities? And are we teaching our children to be sensitive people? So thinking about all those ideas all coming together, I just wanted to think about one idea for the Pesach Seder that I wanted to translate over. One is actually making space to make sure that everybody has a voice at the table. There's always going to be somebody who feels like they can't share. And I actually think if we're thinking about the idea that the Pesach Seder is supposed to be a moment of family and a space for all people, all children, all types at that Seder, are we doing a good enough job to make sure that everybody has a space where they can interject, and maybe not just like dropping it on them? For some people who maybe are not natural oversharers, or they feel like it's harder for them to get in on the Pesach Seder, that might be a moment, particularly if it's one of your children, to maybe sit with them a day or two before and go through their Haggadah and kind of mark it with them. Do you think this is something that you would want to share? Let's practice it. Let's think about it. Or how would you like to be involved in the Pesach Seder? Which brings the other piece a little bit, is thinking about it from a multimodal perspective in terms of giving kids jobs that are age and developmentally appropriate to help them feel excited about the Pesach Seder. So you have to know your people, you have to know yourself. But I oftentimes really feel that, especially for a certain demographic, one way to make the Pesach Seder come alive is to really energize the table with a lot of stuff. So thinking about what you could do for the 10 plagues, whether it's having lots of frogs on the table. Do you want your table spread to look like basically Kriyat Yamsuf? That's such a fun activity. I think sometimes it's really hard. For the Erev Pesach is a busy day for a lot of people. Different people have done more advanced planning. Some people have done less advanced planning. So I think if you have younger kids at home and that's feeling stressful, I have outsourced a lot sometimes to kids to decorate the Pesach Seder. Think magnet tiles. Okay, wash your magnet tiles, do whatever you feel like you need to do, but I don't think there's anything on there that's la'ochel kelev. But I don't know your magnet tiles, but using those magnet tiles to build little pyramids and letting kids put them on the table. You can either get on Amazon or like make yourself, again, know your bandwidth, know what's available to you financially, arts and crafts wise. You can make frogs. You could kind of take paper plates, have the kids draw on them, paint them green, put googly eyes, and like make a little mouth. So fun, so cute, not so complicated. Or you could buy a bunch of different frogs in advance. We admittedly have bought a pyro costume in our house. We also have like a big hat that has like a frog that sits on it. Sometimes I have like different packages that I try to make up before when we were just us in our own home, where you had like all the Eser Mako bags, even just like having kids. My mother, I learned this early on from my mother-in-law, who Baruch Hashem is a matriarch to a lot of grandchildren. So, and people and children and grandchildren, and there's a lot of people at the Pesach Seder. And from like the first time, Pesach was my first holiday with my in-law family. And they do seating cards, even for people who are coming over for another meal for a lunch. She has all the children sitting around decorating and making seating cards. And she's very thoughtful about like who's sitting next to who and where people are sitting and strategizing that and making sure it gets mixed up at each meal. So really that's something that doesn't take a lot of time. It's a great activity for children because for the most part, they like decorating. It incorporates some writing, incorporates some drawing. You can give different people different jobs. Someone can cut, somebody can fold, somebody, there's lots of activities there to do. And so I think it's actually super, super, super thoughtful, super easy. It's also even good for adults to like actually give that to somebody and say, hey, can you help me make like a seating chart, what's going to work for people, or even just asking somebody who's older, like thinking about the fact that like, it's not necessarily has to be a young child who doesn't always love inserting themselves, but like being able to say, I was thinking that like, is a really complicated part of the Seder. Would you be willing to take this on and bring it to life for us in a specific way? Could be a game. I know people should speak to Rabbi Wald. He has a very serious I think it's like escape the room situation that he does for Pesach. Very intricate, very complicated. I encourage people to speak to him about it. It's way outside my ability, but he has like a tremendous amount of chinuch ability, and that is quite brilliant. And so he has like a very elaborate game. It's much better for teenagers, much better for a bigger audience. So I think really thinking about ways to bring it to life in a very passionate way. And I think the other thing I'm thinking about from a generational perspective in terms of bringing it to life is encouraging everybody to take a pause and ask themselves, what brings meaning to their Pesach Seder? What's something that's like a family minhag that may make sense, may not make sense, but it's something that people have been doing for generations and generations and generations. And even, and figuring out how to really inculcate it. That's what this night is about. And sometimes it's about taking a pause and thinking about even just explaining, like, we've been doing this for so many years, or this is a food that has been in the family for so many years. And this is why we do that. Even if it's something silly, like shaking the table for Eliyahu and making the wine spill. Everyone, kind of, there's something very sweet about every family's own little minhagim, own tunes, and really being articulate about it. And so really thinking about the ways in which we can bring life in all ways to the Pesach Seder. Okay, so I think you could do lots of things with moons. We didn't talk about Parsha Chodesh, but Parsha Chodesh also renewal, setting time, establishing time, such a huge critical part of who we are as a people, the first mitzvah. And its relationship to Pesach, so important. I think you could do lots of moon things going on here. I love the Oreos. I actually haven't done the Oreos yet. Actually, these might be whoopee cushions. I'm not exactly sure. I gotta take a larger, whoopie pies or something like that, but that one's just a chocolate cake, and then they just put the different moon cycles on top. I'm assuming that looks like powdered sugar if I'm looking very closely, and like they must have covered different pieces of it to make it look like different stages of the moon. I've also seen it done with Oreos, also a win. This cake just looks very like perfect. It's easy because you just make a chocolate cake, and I think they used frosting, but you don't have to. I was actually thinking you could actually outsource this to a child and have them cut up marshmallows and decorate it like a half moon on your cupcakes or your cakes. So clearly I'm all about outsourcing desserts to my children. So I encourage people to do the same. And I hope everybody has a meaningful and wonderful Shabbat, a Shabbat Mevarchim, and a Chodesh Tov, and it should be a month of Besuot Tovot. Good news. I think there's a lot of people who need some refuah, so a lot of refuah. And a weekend of learning more about increased sensitivity to the people around us, to the world around us, and continuing to think about ways in which we can increase our thoughtfulness around the upcoming Pesach Seder. Hope everybody has a Shabbat Tov and a Chodesh Tov. Thank you.